We are going to talk about COVID then and now. So I'm going to share our little presentation. And we've had a lot of changes just since when we came up with this in January. It's rapidly changing, as we all have seen through the past year. We were changing our protocols daily, as I'm sure you saw at your offices. So we're going to hopefully break some myths and truths today and get some answers to more things on an in-depth level than what we have maybe seen or heard, and try to figure out what's true and what's not true. That's your love, your wife, and the cars are both some of your loves.
Yes, that is an addiction.
Getting tested. So I wanted to ask about the rapid test versus the PCR test, and about all the false positives and negatives that we had heard were coming out.
Sure. Just to give everybody a little bit of a background, Avicenna Medical was essentially the only game in town last year when COVID hit in the middle of March. We were quite prepared for this. If anyone remembers, even primary care offices closed down, specialists closed down. We had patients coming to us essentially stating that their primary care hasn't returned their call in 3 weeks and their offices have shut down. Even other urgent care centers had signs on their doors saying, we can only see you for injuries. And if you have a cough or a cold, don't even walk into our center. So it was about this 3-4 month period that it literally was like people treated anyone that may even been around COVID as like some plague. And because of that, from March until now, we have had over 150,000 patient encounters with COVID citywide, and have treated over 10,000 positive COVID patients. So if you look at those numbers, they're not universities that have that much data that they have single-handedly been able to review and see. So, what I can tell you is that this is not a woulda, coulda, shoulda. This is not I heard from somebody. This is our patients coming through Jacksonville for nearly over a year now. And again, over 150,000 patients that we have seen with, latest data shows somewhere 10 to 13,000 that were positive that we saw at our offices.
That is amazing. Wow.
Thank you.
I did not realize. I knew you were busy. I didn't realize you were that busy.
So traditionally, in this day and age, anytime you want to identify a virus, and this is also true for RSV, for influenza and other viruses, they have tests that are, antigen based, and there are tests that PCR stands for polymerase chain reaction for anyone that has, biology or molecular biology background. And basically what a PCR process involves, it's very lengthy, and it requires, what they do is they take pieces of the genetic material and they amplify it millions of times to be able to diagnose, to see if there's a presence of that virus, areas that they can identify. And it has a very, very high sensitivity and specificity for this test. Now, to break things down, anytime in medicine, when we talk about a sensitivity or a specificity of a test, sensitivity means is how likely is it that this test is going to identify a positive of whatever we're testing within this population. So it's like throwing a net out and saying, out of these 1,000 people, how many that truly have this thing will we be able to identify? So that's what sensitivity is. Specificity is, hey, it's literally looking at the opposite side of the coin. What is the likelihood that if this test is positive, that it really is positive? So it's not considering the negative people. It's considering once you determine and you said, hey, we have these 100 people that the test shows positive, how many of them are they really positive? So that's specificity. The issue is that there is really no way to have 100% on both, because it is a fine balance. Because you can make a test that is, if you made a test that was 100% sensitive, you would be jeopardizing specificity, because what that means is you're throwing such a wide net out that you're bound to catch things that are not meant to be part of what you're looking for. So typically across the board, we want, in any medical test, if your sensitivity is over 90% and your specificity is over 90%, that's considered a very good test. You know, once you start dropping to the 80s, then you're like, okay. And as that number goes down, it gets even worse. To give you just kind of an idea of some other examples, like when you go to a physician's office, let's say before COVID, and you were doing a flu test and they would swab your nose, the sensitivity of that test is in the mid 70th percentile, which means that if you took 100 people that actually we knew 100% that they had influenza, whether it doesn't matter which type, A, B, non-AB, and we did our normal test that is available for influenza at every physician's or hospital, you would only detect 75 or so out of 100. So 25 that would have the flu would get missed, which is with the influenza, for example, why it ends up being a clinical diagnosis, because the test itself is not that great. In medicine, we really don't like tests that give us a correct answer 3 out of 4 times. You know, just not very good. Now, the specificity of it is almost 100%. So that's what happens. So this is a great example of, by reducing the sensitivity, you're like, the one that we get for sure has it. So, you know, it'll have a low sensitivity, but it almost has like a 100%. So it's almost like your pregnancy test. It's impossible for you to go buy a pregnancy test from any grocery store, pee on it, and have a line show up and be a false pregnancy. That is because it has it has like a 99.99% specificity. And I hear this all the time. Ladies will go buy one positive. Okay, no, let me go buy another brand, 5 of them. Oh, they're positive too.
Can't believe it. Yeah.
I don't believe any of that. Let me go to my doctor's office. It's positive. Listen, the first one that's positive is never going to change. Short of you having some hydatid mole or something that, you know, some cyst or tumor that's producing HCG. But again, so that's one reason that we really don't trust the flu test as much. And there are plenty of patients that come into my office during flu season. And listen, if you have body aches, you have 102 fever, you look like you got hit by a train, I don't care what that flu test shows, you have influenza. Now, this is prior to COVID, because now we have other things thrown in the mix.
So that's why most people want to go and get retested just to double check that their negative wasn't. Okay.
The collection process is very important. How you collect, like for example, studies show that if someone is very dry in their nasopharyngeal area and you swab it, you're not getting as much material. And even, for example, the flu test shows, hey, if you want to increase the sensitivity, you can do nasal washing, which kind of sucks. Patients don't like it because you take, you know, some fluid, squirt up their nose, and you collect that washing, and you have a much more likelihood to, you're essentially, as kind of what I said, you're kind of increasing the odds of, you know, catching some viruses or whatever that may be somewhere in the crevices. And with that nasal washing, it helps improve your sensitivity. Now, with flipping to COVID, the type of test that is used is significant. And to kind of break them up, you either have a PCR test and you have the antigen test. PCR test, there's really no such a thing as a rapid PCR test. PCR tests take, for the longest, it's pretty much your major labs that are able to do it, such as Quest or LabCorp. And they've gotten better now, but I would say from March to about December, if you took a swab for a PCR and you send it to Quest, you would get your results in 7 to 10 days. And again, as good as that test is, if I don't have my result for 7 and 10 days, that makes it a useless test. So you have to kind of consider everything in a context, because we're talking about, hey, the determination of whether someone needs to be quarantined, go to work, go to school, and all those things. And it's like, okay, well, you got all the symptoms. It could be COVID, it could be flu, it could be RSV, it could be the 75 other viruses that are out there. But guess what? We're not going to know these results for 7 to 10 days. And that is not as great as a test itself could be. If you have limitations surrounding the test, such as Quest or LabCorp being backed up for a week, then that doesn't become such a great test either. PCRs have traditionally been shown to have sensitivities in the upper 90th percentile. We're talking 95, 96, 97%, with specificity in the 99 to 100% range. So it is kind of as good as it gets. But again, that goes with the assumption that I will swab you and run that test in the next hour or so. What was happening during March and pretty much for the entire year, that's not what happens, because we're dealing with live biological agents. So you imagine we swab a patient, put it in a specimen bag. Let's say patient was seen at 9 a.m. Quest comes at noon to pick up the lab, the specimens. Well, Quest or LabCorp do not run any of their tests here locally. It goes to their central lab in Tampa. So we could track the test. We would see, okay, it left here on a flight at 7 p.m., flew to Tampa. In Tampa, it gets sorted out. So then they look and say, okay, can we handle these tests? No, we're too backed up. Well, let's send this to our Miami office. So then I'll see, okay, well, this batch went all from Tampa, then the next day it went to Miami. It goes to Miami, they run it or they don't run it. Then it's like, no, Miami's too busy. Let's send this to California. I have seen our swabs go from Jacksonville, Tampa, Miami, Virginia, California. And 7 days later, that swab was actually processed.
So that's why we had so many bad negative people and spread so big.
Yes. So Harvard did a study that showed that not the fault of PCR, but due to collection issues, due to times of them being run, that your sensitivity can drop as low as 80%. Because, I have once it leaves my hands, once it leaves a physician's office, I have absolutely zero control if these specimens were handled properly, what happened during the transfer. I wouldn't even mind if it went, let's say, to Tampa and sat in the fridge for 7 days. I would think, okay, maybe, I'll have a better chance. But every time it's taken out, transported from this office to another office on a plane, the more variables you add into that equation, the more likely that something is not going to go as planned.
Right.
And we were able to early on, so company Quidel came up with the Sophia 2 test, which is a rapid antigen test. And we ended up choosing that test for a few reasons. One, it actually got an FDA approval of like 96.7% on its sensitivity and a 100% on its specificity, which is pretty much as good as it can possibly get. So they've done head-to-head studies with PCRs, and it shows it's just as accurate, assuming they were done at the same time. And if the PCR was ran 7 days ago, the rapid antigen test, particularly this Quidel one, beats it heads and shoulder. Now, just saying antigen test does not define what it is. That's just like me again saying a car or a motorcycle. It could be a Pinto or it could be a Mercedes-Benz. There are many, many other antigen tests that are out there that do not have that approval rate. So for example, if you remember when the Regency Mall was doing the test that was done by the city, well, that test was an Abbott test made by Abbott Laboratories. And the Abbott Laboratory test had only an 82% sensitivity with like an 88% specificity. So it means that 100 people that have COVID go there, only 82 out of 100 get notified that they have COVID. So 18 of them are just walking around spreading COVID. And on the specificity side, that if they're positive, there's also another 20% chance that they may not be positive. So this really comes to not everything, the British have a saying that we're not that rich to buy cheap things or free things, because there's always a give and take. Anything that's handed to you for free usually comes at a cost somewhere. And that was one of those things. And again, that was an antigen test, but they reduced the price significantly to be able to sell it to the masses and the cities and so on. And, for a lot of it is kind of like, hey, we're doing this thing just to check off a box. Hey, we're providing testing.
Right.
But it wasn't
Are
the
we
best
still seeing a lot of people get tested here? Are we still seeing numbers up or down? I'm assuming down.
Now we're seeing, well, the numbers are nowhere what they used to be. You know, the peak of it, I would say, was like November, December. I mean, especially around holidays, because you have people going for Thanksgiving, coming for Thanksgiving. They got together, they got exposed, and bam, Christmas came around, the New Year's. So that period was really, really busy, like just insane amount of number of patients. But those were mostly patients that were not sick. They just thought that they were either exposed or they felt somebody told them they were exposed. Like, so that's what was happening. Now, we're not seeing as much of normal patients. We have patients that are coming in and actually sick and are symptomatic. And of course, with the fear, and of course, we're still in the middle of flu season. There's RSV, there's rhinovirus, there's adenovirus. You know, I can name 20 of the viruses that are going around. So every time someone coughs, sneezes, has a body ache, obviously the job is like, you got to go get tested for COVID, work, you know, so that's what we're seeing now.
We used to get looked at bad if we had just a cough from the allergies when this first came out.
So now, so basically so antigen test, so the biggest advantage of the antigen test is that the results can be had within half hour to 45 minutes. So that way you can actually change the direction and the course of the disease process. Because if somebody comes in and they're exposed, and whether they're symptomatic, and one thing to remember is that 50%, all data across the country and really the world show that almost 50% of patients that contract COVID remain asymptomatic through their entire disease process. And even more that remain asymptomatic for the first 5 to 7 days while they're still contagious and they don't show symptoms. So it's very important that the moment someone tests positive, that you notify them, you tell them, hey, you're positive, you need to stay home, not go to work, you know, so you can stop that propagation of that fire spreading. If you let them go and then 10 days later you call them, hey, by the way, your COVID is positive, I mean, the horses have already left the barn. I'm not sure what can be done at that point besides just more of an FYI, like, hey, hope I mean, this is before we got our machines, we would see patients that were quite sick. We would do a PCR test because that was the only thing available essentially in March and beginning of April. And we would send the patients home like, hey, we'll let you know when your PCR is back. And then 10 days later, 8 days later, we would get the result. And it's like, it's positive. And if you know, a lot of people have obviously relaxed and kind of let their guards down. But if you remember March, April, it was the sky is falling. And so I would personally call the patients to let them know that their COVID's positive. And if that phone rang 3 times, like my heart would sing like, oh my God, I hope this patient didn't have a bad outcome, because I don't know what happened the last 7 to 10 days while we were waiting for this result.
Yeah, so they might have been in the hospital.
So when we were able to get the Quidel Sophia 2 test that had a 97% sensitivity with essentially 100% specificity, it was like a godsend for us. And we used that, and we were essentially, because we acted very early on in March, we were the only medical center in town that had the Sophia machine. I think the next medical place that got it was like in September. I mean, that's how much of a lag there was in between the two. So that is essentially antigen test. And the antigen is that. So the question is, what is an antigen test? An antigen is every virus has essentially, think of antennas or spike proteins that is essentially their signature that says, I am who I am. No different than, an emblem on a car. Like, you don't have to see the whole car, but I don't know if you see the Toyota sign, well, you know it's a Toyota, for example. If you see the H, you know it's a Honda. So think of that as an antigen. So with an antigen test, it's not looking at the entire virus like a PCR would, where it's trying to look for pieces of the genetic material to amplify. It's looking for very key markers like its antigen. And if it's present, it's able to quickly diagnose it that way. It's almost like, a felon that has known tattoos. You don't need to do a DNA test on the person, but if you know very well that this felon has 5 very identifying tattoos on their body, you see that combination and you're like, that's that person. You don't need to see a driver's license. You don't need to do a DNA test on them to make sure it's the same person. It becomes, so essentially think of antigen testing that way. So I hope that answers. I know it was a very long answer, but I had to kind of set up the background for everyone to really
that's a lot of information. I hope everybody out there understood it. I think it made sense to me, perfect sense. You explained it very well. So with having COVID afterwards, I hear you have antibodies for up to 3 months, maybe longer. So I've heard about
T
cells being in your body, the T cell antibodies. And what should those people, should they think they're immune now, or should they be cautious still, or what?
It is literally, so I have patients of ours that, so just one thing, when you hear CDC, WHO, any organization come out with any blanket statement that is just anything as a blanket statement, automatically consider it false, because medicine does not follow any set guideline, right? Just think about it. COVID doesn't read CDC's instructions. Viruses don't care what I think. They do what they want to do. So, for example, when CDC comes out and they changed their guidelines 17 times last year. So first, which was the correct one because it was actually guided by the medical community. So if you remember back, it was, hey, once you have COVID, to make sure you're negative, you need to quarantine for 14 days and then have 2 tests back to back, 24 hours apart. And if both of those tests are negative, then you're considered negative. And they did that is because even with, let's say, the antigen test or PCR test, since the sensitivity is not 100%, if you have a test today, that's 96, 97% sensitivity, and tomorrow you have a test that's 96, 97% sensitivity, that makes it even more likely that you're close approaching 98, 99 percentile, because now you have 2 of them to compare back to back. Well, during, some of it political, some of it not, lack of supplies, not everybody could get tested. And they're like, first it was like, you don't need 2 tests. 1 test is fine. Then it was like more lack of supplies, lack of testing. And it was like, you should be good after 10 days. Like you should be negative after 10 days, which is categorically false, because when you make a blanket statement that you're not contagious after 10 days, you're essentially trying to make people believe that somehow on the 9th evening at midnight, the virus is like, Cinderella's carriage, just poof, go and disappear, which is absolutely ludicrous to think of that. Nothing happens from the 9th day to the 10th day. We've had plenty of patients that were positive 4 weeks after they got COVID. So out of these 10, 15,000 patients that we tested that were positive, there's about 10 to 15% of patients, just like anything else, you have your average, median, and then you have your outliers. So you have about 10 to 15% of patients that, due to their immune system that's very healthy, due to the amount of viral load that they got in their body that could have been very small, are able to clear the virus, as in turn negative, in 10 days or less. But that's about 10 to 15%. On the other extreme, there are 10 to 15% of patients that will take longer than 14 days to 18 days to clear the virus. One of my own nurses got COVID about 3 months ago, and she was positive for 6 weeks. And she was in the, and it's, and well, from what we see, the sicker you were, the longer it takes. That means you had a really bad, because it's different. If someone, is standing 4 feet from me and I get 100,000 viruses in my body, and someone directly sneezes in Jamie's face and she gets 5 million of the viruses in her body, well, it would be erroneous to think that we're going to have the same disease process. If 1,000 soldier enemies landed on our beach versus 100,000 soldier enemies land on our beach, well, our outcome is going to be different. Whether we win or not, we're still going to have more damage the more kind of enemy lands on our beaches. So same thing, there's no way for us to know. So what we do know is that the sicker the patients are, typically, the longer it takes. That means they had a bigger viral load. So the curve is higher, which means it's going to take longer for those viruses to leave their body, which is why, again, no 2 people are the same. You can't apply any blanket statement really to anything in medicine. I mean, there's not really one thing in medicine until that you can apply to everybody. Everything is more of a guideline, what we see generally, and you adjust and move on from there.
Okay.
So with antibodies, we have seen, and there's some people, we've had a handful of patients that were COVID positive, guaranteed. They were tested more than once. They were COVID positive and never developed any antibody at all. And kids are notorious for this. And a lot of that has to do with, it's almost like the better your immune system, your body almost didn't even react to it. Like it treated that COVID as like just a bump in the road. Like it just was like not got rid of it. Your immune system just attacked it, destroyed it because you really did not, your body was not stressed by any means. You never developed antibodies. And we have a handful of patients. One of the owners of Avicenna, Dr. Modell, he got COVID, had a very, very mild illness, and he never developed antibodies. And we've tested him multiple times. So again, that is a very, very small percentage. Most people develop antibodies, and those antibodies typically stay for at least 5 to 6 months. We have patients that contracted COVID last March or April, and they're still antibody positive today, a year later. I had a patient that came yesterday that saw me that was COVID positive in April, and they're still antibody positive now. So there is no rhyme or reason. So when you hear, oh, antibodies only last 3 months, false. If you said antibodies last a year, it's false, because there is no, refer back to, there is no blanket statement that can be applied in medicine. All we know is a general idea. So what we tell patients is now we have, and when I say we, the medical community, but obviously including Avicenna, because we have an antibody test. It's just a finger prick. So think about it, antibody, because it's in the blood. It's not in your sputum or your bodily fluids. It's in your blood. It requires a finger prick. And in 20 minutes, it tells you whether you have antibodies or not. And it has a 100% sensitivity, which means if you have antibodies, now mind you, this has nothing to do with whether you had COVID or not. This test is, do you have antibodies right now when we prick your finger? So you sure could have had COVID a year ago. So it cannot be used for diagnosis. So when people come in and their antibodies negative, does that mean I didn't have COVID? No, you could have had COVID and your antibodies expired last week, or they ran out below a threshold. All it means is, do you have antibodies at the present time or not?
So and antibodies will help you?
I'm sorry?
Will they help you from getting COVID?
100%.
Okay.
Yeah, it's better. Yeah, I mean, once you have the antibodies, and mind you, these are your beta cell antibodies. You cannot really measure T cell antibodies with any of these things, and those are retained immunities. So this is why now you hear the tune regarding the vaccine that, once a year, you're going to need a booster shot, that this is not a one-time thing, because it acts essentially the same way as, your natural body. There's some school of thought that believes that if you've had COVID and you developed a high enough antibody, that your natural antibodies work better. There's some school of thought that believes that the vaccine gives you higher levels of antibodies typically, but they may decline faster. It is too early. And we'll know about this. We'll have more data in this in 5 years, and we'll look back and say, this is what it looked like. But right now, pretty much we recommend, our patients that are at high risk, particularly patients over 40. Like, I'm not there fist bumping where everyone should be vaccinated. Parents ask, should I have my kids vaccinated? I personally say no, because in 150,000 patients and in 15,000 patients, including kids, because we see everybody, and we've had plenty of kids that were COVID positive, we've never had one single bad outcome with kids. Kids' immune systems are generally so great compared to adults that it really acts as just a bump in the road for them. The reason you hear, on the news that some kid somewhere had a bad outcome is because of that, because it's news, because it just doesn't happen. Right now, you're not hearing again, some gentleman died due to COVID in Texas, because it's kind of almost expected. You don't hear it. You just hear a total number. 5,000 people died this month. But when there is a 12-year-old, you'll hear about it specifically because it's news, because it doesn't happen. And still, when you kind of dig deep enough, there was always some underlying health condition or something that contributed to that negative outcome.
Gotcha. I'm going to skip, so I know you answered a little bit about the vaccine. I wanted to skip to this one right here. How easily is COVID spread through fomites?
Not easily. And more data has come out essentially that shows that greater than 90% of COVID contractions happen from direct contact. So talking, hugging, coughing, kissing, sharing cups, utensils, being in very close proximity. It's because you still need a large amount. If I had 10 viruses and I got in you, that is not going to get you sick. You need hundreds of thousands of these viruses to enter your respiratory tract. And even though there's, conflicting data that, this virus stays on this surface for so many hours and so on, there's not been really, from the data that we've seen, a single evidence that shows that, let's say this person was in quarantine or isolation and they went and touched the doorknob that had COVID and suddenly they got COVID. Almost every case when they do contact tracing, it comes from, so this concept of, oh my God, I need to wipe down the chair that I sit on. It's not going to get contracted through, your jeans, so some of those we need to kind of calm down a little bit.
Okay. And then I think this might be our last question. I know we're running out of time. I think we're a little over time. Mask, the N95 fit test versus the ones you buy at Home Depot for cleaning out your garage or something, painting. How effective is the whole, people were trying to say double mask, and do we need certain materials to be effective? What do you think on this?
Yeah, masks are such a controversial subject. And I'll say this, masks, particularly N95 masks, are made to be used in a very short time period. I used to be the attending at University of Florida Shands, and your N95 mask was to go into the TV unit for 5 minutes and come out. This was not a mask that you wear all day for 12 hours. Anyone in the world is extremely uncomfortable. You can't breathe through it really that well. And patients come in because they got headaches, dizziness, you literally are deprived. You're constantly, it's like breathing through a coffee straw. And then there's this question about, okay, when you have this, you constantly are touching your face, you're constantly adjusting it, and then you touch something else because they've done kind of some quasi studies where someone that doesn't have a mask on, any type of mask, touches their face X number of times per day. And then they monitor people typically that have masks, and you end up touching your face like 10 times the number that you normally do when you don't have a mask. So even though fomites are not necessarily a problem, but if you have if you're in a medical field where you may be at a higher exposure rate and your hands may not be, and this is the same thing as masks. Masks are meant, I have to have this discussion with my staff. Patients forget about it. People have this tendency that they put on a pair of gloves, and they think that somehow that protects them all day. And so what they do is they wear the glove, and for the next 3 hours, that same glove is on and they're doing something else. Purpose of the glove is you put the glove on, do that one thing you got to do, and gloves got to come off. Because the moment you touch that clipboard, the moment you touch that first pen, the moment you touch that first specimen bag that's just sitting in a drawer, your gloves are no longer sterile. You actually have a better chance of not having any gloves and just either washing your hand and using sanitizer, because people get this false sense of security that, oh, I have gloves. It's about, yes, you had this glove for the last 4 hours on, and I've seen you see 30 patients with it. Yeah. How is that? The glove is no different than your skin. So unless you're washing your hands with your glove or you're putting sanitizer in your gloves, and again, there's data that the bacteria stick to rubber more or latex than in your own hand. So there is really no great answer. What we do know is that virologists that want to prevent getting viruses, they are literally in a spacesuit, correct? If you ever see any of the movies, those are not fake, virologists, microbiologists that work with, particles that are dangerous or considered a pandemic. They're in a suit with a supplied oxygen from an outside source. They're fully sealed. Anything less than that, they're not double masking. They're not wearing gloves. Anything less than that, we know that is not 100%. So now, is it 90? Is it 80%, 70% effective? There's been no double-blind placebo study to be able to compare those two. And that is essentially, we do know there's no question that if you have one N95 mask versus two, or you have one cloth mask or three cloth masks, the more barriers that you put from the outside world to you, you're going to reduce your chances. So that for sure will prevent some things. But this idea that is going to be this just magical thing that's just going to stop all transmission, it could be a 10% effectiveness versus not wearing a mask. And guess what? For some people, that 10% may be the difference of having a bad outcome or not a bad outcome. But as long as we have that awareness that, or I see this all the time, and I'm sure you guys see it with your friends and family, they've had the same raggedy mask for the last year, and it's thrown in the truck, it's sitting on a dashboard. It's like, I'm not sure what that's doing for you. So these are things that we could talk about it for the next 5 hours and we don't come to any real conclusion, but these are things that we should all, as kind of intelligent human beings, kind of think about on a regular basis. Like, what are we actually doing?
Oh, thank you so much. And I forgot to mention new offices opening up in Middleburg and on Normandy. And he just posted on Facebook, they are hiring X-ray techs and MAs right now. We have a class graduating, so I'm going to tell them about it. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Have a wonderful day. Take care, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right. They are leaving for lunch. And my class come back at 12:45.